Today is April 8th, 2021. My name is Enshi. I'm Associate Curator at the Houston Asian American Archive at Rice University. We're so honored to be documenting Byron Kim's oral history today while he's an artist in residence at Rice University's Moody Center for the Arts, even though it's done remotely due to the pandemic. And Byron is taking this interview from San Diego. We're also enjoying his beautiful art on campus as his works are part of the group exhibition Artists and the Roscoe Chapel, 50 Years of Inspiration, curated by Dr. Frauke Johansson. So thank you so much, Lauren, for joining us today so generously with your time.
Oh, you're welcome. Thanks for asking me.
Yeah, so to start, we are going to start from the very beginning. Where were you born?
I was born in the town where I'm speaking to you from. It's called La Jolla. It's in San Diego County, California, in 1961.
Great. Can you describe the neighborhood and the household you grew up in?
Oh, um, the house is a typical kind of suburban California tract housing. It's on the top of a ridge, I guess. Not that far from the ocean, maybe 20 minutes to half hour walking and mm, just a few minutes bike ride or by car. Um, and the house. Well, actually, I didn't grow up. My early childhood was not in this house where my parents still live. This house was, I lived there from 1971 to 1979. So about fifth grade to the end of high school. And I was born in La Jolla, but before 1 year of age, my parents and I moved to Connecticut. First to Hartford, Connecticut, and my sister was born there. And then we moved to a small town called Wallingford in Connecticut, which is between Hartford and New Haven. And and we moved back to San Diego in 1971. I think that summer. And yeah, so I just have the one sibling, Sharon, who's 3 years younger than I am.
That's interesting. You moved around so much during your childhood. Do you recall some of the memories moving around so much?
Oh, it's interesting you interpret it as moving around a lot. I don't think of having moved around that much um, compared to some people. Well, um, I don't remember much from my very early childhood in California because I was less than a year old. So I don't have any direct memories, only indirect memories. And then Connecticut was kind of a typical childhood for that time in the early 60s. Just, parents were not so afraid to let their children go do whatever they wanted to do. So I remember having a lot of freedom to just walk around in I think it's quite suburban now, that area, but it felt like the countryside to me when I was young. And so I remember running around in the countryside with my friends. And there were no Asian uh, friends, childhood friends in that area. And we saw family in other places in New England and in New York, but um, well, family and Korean friends, but nobody lived nearby who was even Asian, even of Asian descent. So I pretty much went to school in elementary school. I went to school pretty much exclusively with white kids. That changed slightly when I got back to California, but not that much actually.
Yeah, that's really interesting to hear. And I'm wondering, born of first generation Korean parents, what were some of the family values and Korean influences you might have from your parents?
Um, I think I have a lot of Korean influences despite having very little Korean community besides my family. Mm, Even though my my parents didn't insist on our uh, being fluent in Korean language. My sister is nearly fluent, I would say. Um, my language ability in general is pretty poor, and my Korean language is not good. Um, but it's not completely missing either. Um, well, I'd say uh, one thing that was instilled in us was very sort of Confucian values, such as respecting elders, and that there's sort of a social hierarchy in that sense, um, and um, also kind of the work ethic. Although I think that was conveyed mostly by example. You know, my parents are both uh, physicians. They're both MDs, and they worked very hard. And my mom especially had a very long career um, as a doctor, and my dad worked hard, and his career was, you know, also long, normal length. But my mom, I remember, worked pretty long. Um, I can't remember exactly, but maybe until she was 70 or so. Uh, think of other ways to answer that question. Um,
Like, how about the family values that they were trying to?
yeah, yeah. The I think that's what I can think of right now. Um, Maybe I can think of more later, but just yeah, what my parents taught me. Um, I think just uh, education was super important. So I can't, I really can't. It's hard for me to say whether how much I think they instilled that in me a lot, but I think that it sort of was self-perpetuated as well. Like I knew that they thought education was important, and then I kind of took that on as my own value.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. Do you
Sure.
remember what food you had back at home, or if your parents are um,
Uh, um, we we ate a lot of Korean food. My mom cooked a lot of Korean food. It was pretty simple food, and I learned how to cook because I was always hungry because she came home late from working quite late hours, and so I would stand next to her while she was cooking. So I learned how to cook at a pretty young age, and um, in in some ways, I think like that was an outlet for my creativity too, like trying to learn how to cook and also um, we ate a lot of we ate Korean. We never my mom never cooked what she called American food or Western food, or very rarely, I think. But we got a lot of takeout, um, a lot of fast food takeout, which I think my mom doesn't really remember because I just reminded her recently of that. And because she was always often coming home late from work, and she felt she was responsible for, providing the meal, she often brought, Kentucky Fried Chicken or McDonald's or, there's lots of different fast food options in San Diego. So we ate a lot of fast food. Um, and I don't know why that reminds me, but one thing that I neglected to mention when you asked what my childhood was like, I watched a lot of TV. I watched that, like in a lot of families, that kind of thing was forbidden. But my parents, I don't know that they thought about it that much about whether it's a good thing to watch TV or not, but it was not restricted, apparently, because when I speak with my other friends who are my age, my current friends, and reminisce about how much TV they watched, I can only think of one person I've met as an adult who watched as much TV as I did. I don't know how that affected me, but I spent a lot of time basically watching TV, uh, doing my homework, and playing with my friends. Later on, I was playing a lot of basketball. That was my kind of my passion.
Oh, that's great. And I'm also wondering, you mentioned playing with your friends during childhood. What were some of the games that you guys play back then?
When you mean when I was really young, or
Yeah, like childhood games.
I don't remember particularly any games, but I do remember like running. I remember getting on our bikes and walking to different remote areas in Wallingford. Um, One place I remember was going to this chemical plant, American Cyanamid, and finding stuff there, which I wonder whether it was dangerous to be playing in that area. But back then things were just so unrestricted and you could just go anywhere. Um, when we moved back to California, um, it wasn't games so much because I was already like, oh, almost in middle school. So Um, well, one game I played a lot was basketball, and we went to the beach a lot. And you know, they used to have these inflatable rafts, and we would go, ride the waves with these inflatable rafts and go body surfing and that sort of thing, and just hang out at the beach.
That sounds fun. And I'm wondering, do your parents speak only English to you? Since you mentioned your Korean isn't as fluent.
They mostly speak English. Yeah, my mom, sometimes she'll speak Korean to me, just just to, I don't know exactly know why she does that, but like most of the Korean that my mom speaks to me, I can understand. So it's basically, we're in the kitchen cooking together or something. She's asking me, what to do, because the roles have reversed. Like when I was young, my mom told me how to cook, and now she claims she doesn't have any ideas for cooking and doesn't want to really cook anymore. So I try to help as much as I can when I'm here. I'm trying to remember your question. Yeah, so the language, my dad pretty much speaks English to us. Our kids, two of them took, well, of the six grandkids, quite a number of them took Korean language class in college. So once in a while, my mom and dad will speak with them in a very basic way in Korean.
Thank you. That's really interesting. And I'm also wondering, have you had any moments during your upbringing that you realize there's any cultural traits or habits that were Korean, but you didn't realize until later on in your life?
Oh, just to continue on with the language, it's not directly your question, your previous question, but I studied Korean language in New York, just unofficially at a Korean language school for a couple of years to try to improve my Korean. And I've always wanted to improve my Korean, but it only got us to a certain level. In some ways, my reading is better than my speaking. As far as cultural traits, you know, I don't know if this is like a stereotype, but I tend to be very reserved in a public speaking situation. You know, so as a teacher, I have one-on-one teaching, but then there's classroom teaching, which I do occasionally, but also there's like a group critique situation in visual art teaching. And I tend to be, when I first started doing that, I was very, very quiet and reserved. I'm less so now, but still I'm not generally the most vocal. So that's one thing. I'm not sure if that's a cultural trait or not, or just personal. Well, I mean, deferring to elders is definitely a cultural trait, but I think I was aware of that all along. So it's not something that surprised me. I can't think of a good example of anything that I became aware of as a Korean or Asian trait that I became aware of later. Maybe that's because I was relatively self-aware of what was Korean and not, even from my youth, because that's because I didn't have any Korean community, so just my family. So I could see such a huge difference between my family and the other and outside. So, you know, if I grew up in Flushing or something, I might have these things and then realize, oh, that's something, you know, Americans don't really know about or do. But every time I walked out of my house, it was a different world. So I was pretty aware of all of that.
Yeah, that's
Very
really interesting.
early.
There's one thing I heard from someone else was that they didn't realize that people don't use scissors as much in cooking. Like in Korean like cuisine, they cut everything with scissors, which is really interesting.
Oh yeah. Um, Yeah, I can't really say. I don't remember about that. Like we use scissors pretty often, but for somehow I don't remember using scissors in the kitchen early on. It seems new to like relatively new to me, but I know it's not new.
Yeah.
But I don't know how long standing that is in Korean uh, in the kitchen culture.
Mhm.
I have no idea. I know it's very pervasive. Yeah.
And
Is it in Chinese kitchen too? Do they use scissors?
not so much as I guess Koreans, I guess, because we
Huh.
still chop like all the vegetables with the very like large, um,
Yeah.
yeah, like rectangular knife.
And if you right, and if you want to make long, relatively tough noodles, cut them. You cut them with a knife, right?
That's
Noodles.
right. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. I think cutting noodles with the scissors is like really good, really efficient way to use scissors.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
Oh,
right.
yeah. I mean, I don't remember when I think it was probably as an adult or a teenager that I became conscious that the Korean spoon is slightly different than other cultures. You know, like Chinese have probably at least a couple different spoons, but the Koreans have like one spoon that is particularly Korean. The handle is a little bit longer. It's the volume, the volume of the
The scoop.
concavity, the scoop is pretty is is pretty similar, I think, to a tablespoon, but it's bigger and shallower. So I don't know whether it was consciously invented this way, but I assume it's because I think even more than Chinese, well, just as much as Chinese cuisine, but maybe possibly a little more. Koreans are sharing their food a lot. So that means a longer handle spoon will be useful. And also with Koreans, more than almost any other culture I've come across, any other cuisine anyway, there are often several things on the table that are still boiling. So you don't want to have like a really deep spoon for that. So that's my theory about the Korean spoon. Um, and I'm very proud of certain Korean things, especially something like that because it's so practical and so subtle. Like it's not that different, but it is like in a way it feels significant.
Yeah, that's super interesting. And next time, I think we can shift gears a little bit towards art and your early education and encounter with art and literature. So you studied at Yale first with the BA in literature. I'm wondering, have your since your parents are both surgeons or MDs, and
They're
they're
MDs, yeah.
MDs, yeah. Do they have any like kind of questions or disagreement when you decided to start pursuing art as your in your studies?
Um, they were not like this stereotypical Asian American parents will who demand that their children become, you know, pursue fields that are going to be financially secure, you know, and professionally respectable in a certain way from the point of view of you know, the immigrant community. Um, so I don't, I think that, you know, it's just different between my mom and my dad, but certainly neither of them were very strongly against my becoming an artist or a writer. I mean, originally I think I wanted to be a poet. And but I think my mom and dad were slightly or somewhat different. I think my mom probably was concerned about my making a living, so I think she preferred that I could become a doctor or something like that, but she didn't voice that opinion very strongly, or at all, really. I'm not sure exactly how I know that. It's just like, I think it's my mom's character to be more practical. And then my dad has always been very supportive of my pursuing anything that I was very interested in. Partly because he, even though he uh, found his own career very successful and satisfying, he thinks that that kind of professional career, especially in pursuit of money, it's not a very interesting way to live your life. So he was always very supportive. They both were. They both are very supportive of whatever I do.
That's wonderful to hear. And how did you become attracted to pursuing art? And I mean, at first literature to begin with. Maybe your
Mhm.
a mentor of your high school teacher or anyone that
Mhm.
affect the decision.
Yeah, it's usually that way, and it was that way in my case too. It was not one particular teacher, but my school. I started off at the public school here in San Diego, but ended up going to private school called La Jolla Country Day School, and they just had a really great English department. So I was introduced by the teachers there, um, Will Erickson and Bruce Boston, especially, um, to different kinds of literature, but somehow I gravitated towards poetry. And then, there are always these accidents that happen that really influence one's life. And we happen to live, and still now this apartment that I'm staying in near my parents' house during the pandemic, um, which they own, also is within walking distance of UC San Diego, UCSD, which is a big uh, school. They have a really wonderful library, which is where the main, they have a wonderful library system, but the main library is a really beautiful modern building. And it's like a big spaceship or space station. And it's not the case now, but at the time I was in high school, the top floor of that building was dedicated to poetry. I think it was, yeah, it was all poetry. So I used to go and study there and do my homework, whatever it was, math, science, history, finish my homework, and all these poetry books to browse. Now they're not open. I mean, of course they're closed now because of the pandemic, but I mean, that poetry collection is not an open stack any longer. I don't know why, but it's a closed. You have to have permission to go look at those books. I guess I should say, I don't know why, when I was in high school, I could just walk in, not being a member of the university at all, just a community member, and just read the books. It's really wonderful. And that's where my love of poetry began.
And how about arts? Did you started painting or doing like any experimental work when
I
you?
did, I did a little bit of art in high school, and there was a wonderful art teacher there, Carol Ann Dana. And so she was very encouraging. And but I didn't do a lot of art. And then when I went to Yale, I also did some art, but mostly in the interest of being well-rounded. Because I was actually much better at science and math. I did a lot of math in school. It, it, I think I probably did more math in high school than anyone at that school up to that point, maybe. It's hard to say because there were many years of that school before me, but I did 2 full years of college calculus by myself during high school, with the math teacher, but not in a class. And so when I got to Yale, I wanted to. It's hard to explain, but I always was more interested in, especially at a place like Yale, where there's so many options and so many really strong fields being taught. I always wanted to pursue the subject area that was most difficult, most interesting, and most difficult. So doing visual art was kind of, it was really interesting to me, but it was really hard. So that's why it's kind of a strange answer, but I eliminated math in the very beginning, not because I was some kind of genius at math, I wasn't, but I was quite good at it, and so it was not difficult for me. Could have gone through and done math and science very easily, I think. In some ways, I have regrets now because science would be so hard for me now to do because I left it a long time ago. But this is strange. This is a very strange logic, and to just constantly pursue things that are difficult doesn't really make sense. But when I was young, I'm not sure why I have that character. I'm gonna close the window. So. Oh, yeah. So I took some art classes just to be well-rounded. Like I should take a little bit of everything, right? Which wasn't really the case because I kind of wish I had taken more philosophy and so forth. But it's probably in some ways too late. So I took some beginning visual art classes without becoming a major, without applying to become a major in that field, in that subject. But I really liked them because they were challenging. Yeah, maybe that's a better word than difficult. And there was one particular professor named Robert Reed, who I think without him, I wouldn't have become an artist. So he was really innovative teacher and extremely motivational. He was a really good teacher for getting you to do work. And so I didn't know it at the time, but he was sort of planting a seed in me and many other students about what it would be like to be an artist and how it's important. And so that's where that all started, I think. And yeah, I mean, there are various anecdotal stories I can tell about how I really began to think of art, visual art above other fields, but I don't know how much time that would take. A lot of time, I think, um, to tell, but I think it suffices to say that it started in college, and um, because it was challenging and interesting. And then when college ended, that, visual art was the thing that I did in college that was the most interesting. So I for some reason I decided to try to continue it, even though I had no idea at that moment that I would become an artist. It was just something to try.
Yeah, it's really interesting how life is taking you to this path. And I'm also curious how diverse was Yale University back then in your year?
Um, I thought it was diverse because I was coming from a place that was not from two different places, nearby in Connecticut when I was young, and also La Jolla, California. Both places were not very diverse. So I found Yale to be wonderfully diverse in terms of its student body. But that was in the late 70s and early 80s, and it was not anywhere near as diverse as it is now. It's so much more diverse now, and it could be even more diverse, but uh, yeah, I guess that's the answer. It seemed diverse, but it was not that diverse. There weren't that many Asian Americans, and I wouldn't be this way now with my current mentality and values, but then I I tended to avoid most of the Asian American student groups. There were several of them, I guess, and I didn't want to be kind of lumped in, and I didn't want to be uh, limit myself to a group like that, and I didn't feel very much in common with them because, as you can imagine, a lot of there weren't that many Asian students, and those that were at Yale at the time, some of them were first generation immigrants, and um, I mean, it's not like it is now where there were many students coming from abroad, but still there were people who, English was not their first language and so forth. So you can imagine why they would really want to have friends who they could go eat with and speak with. But I didn't feel any closeness with them. So I didn't I I ended up not wanting to hang out with them. I think if I had to do it over again somehow, if I had like this mentality that, putting it into that 18-year-old person, I would have reached out more to those people. I think I would have found a lot more in common with them than I thought that I had at the time. I mean, having said that, three of my closest friends were Asian American. One of them was Korean. Um, I'm not in close touch with them now, but I know I'm a little bit in touch with one of them, and I know what they're all doing. Those three.
Yeah, that's really interesting to hear that story about how you come back to view your own time in university. And I'm wondering, how did that time impacted you in how you reflect and view your Korean American identity?
Oh,
Or if I should say, like uh, during that time as an Asian student, but who is an Asian student not from Asia as first generation, like how would the other students see you or treat you differently from the first generation student there?
I can't tell. I was kind of oblivious to that. Like it was almost to the point where um, I wouldn't say that I was really actively avoiding them, but I didn't, when they invited me to events, just simple events like going to go get food together, I would generally refuse. So I don't know how, I mean, just from that evidence, they were very kind to me, and I wasn't very, I feel I wasn't very kind in return in a way. Um, in some ways, I was almost going to say it was very important for me to assimilate to American culture, but that's not quite true. It's not exactly accurate. It's that in a way I was already assimilated. So it was hard for me to assimilate to Asian culture in school, you know, Asian American culture or other. I mean, there certainly were a few students from other countries, and I didn't feel much um, in common with them. I think that's because I was emotionally and socially immature. Um, I I think now I would definitely want to hang out with them. So, and I'm a teacher now at the same school, so I feel very strong uh, um, connection with my students that are of Asian descent, because I know that they have some of them have difficulty, you know, like either getting along with other students or just trying to make their way in a field that isn't especially friendly to um, artists of Asian descent. It's not it's complicated and strange, the art world's relationship to Asian artists.
Yeah, I guess since we're already talking about this topic as Asian American artists, like in your earlier career, did you feel that you have to try extra hard to and endure more difficulty to kind of break that boundary and enter the art world?
Well, I don't know that I would say I felt a lot of difficulty, but I definitely felt that there was a boundary, like a difference between artists of all ethnicities were treated differently by the art world. You know, white male artists got full full entry, like they didn't. There was no question about whether they belonged or not, and you know, it's the way the art world works. It's all by kind of like insistence on you're making particular kind of work given who you are, um, which frankly is terrible. It's really awful. You know, it's changing very slowly, but you know, I mean, a strong example of that is that, of course, as an artist, you can make anything you want. But if you want to be an artist in the art world and have your work accepted, let's say, especially in the marketplace of the art world, then, you know, if you, there is a long period of time, which continues to some degree, if you're of an artist of African descent, you were expected to make a certain kind of work. You know, you couldn't make abstract work and expect to be accepted, you know, like given big shows or have your work sold. That's changing now for some people, but it's just changing now after so many decades and even centuries of this art market. And so the same goes for artists of Asian descent. You know, it's not as specific in certain ways, but like the best example I can give you about how complex and what's the word? Looking for a word that's like capricious. It's the best example for the way in which the art world is so capricious with regard to how it treats Asian artists is that, you know, as you probably know, there was a generation recently a generation of Chinese artists who became super famous and made huge careers, very much in parallel with the rise of China as an economic power. This is not a coincidence. But so a good example is Ai Weiwei. Do you know? Well, he came to New York when he was a young artist. And I don't think I ever met him, but we coincided in New York, I think. Like when I first came and before he left, I don't know how long he was there, but there are other people that he was friendly with in New York who were Chinese artists who remained in New York, didn't go back to China. And some of them are probably are very strong artists, and they have very low recognition because they stayed in America. So I'm sure that a few of them would have become superstars had they gone back to China. But at the time, it wouldn't make sense for them to go back to China because there was no opportunity for artists in China. You know, I think Ai Weiwei's biography allowed him, you know, his I don't know his biography very well, but I'm just guessing his family circumstances allowed him to go back to China and still live comfortably as he continued his career. Anyway, the art world is so capricious and arbitrary that way. There's so many examples where the machinery of the art market just decides that, you know, one person is acceptable and the next person is not acceptable on the basis of their biography, which not so much on the basis of their work. So, I mean, that happens also on a different level, but it's all very complicated and it's such a small world, and it doesn't, it's not 100 percent based on merit is partly what I'm trying to say. I don't know. I it seems like some of my responses to your questions, they go off in the, I don't know if I'm answering the question anymore, but that was, the question was about your last question maybe was about art and ethnicity, maybe.
Yeah, I was asking about the endurance as Asian American artists in early career and breaking that boundary. Um,
Right.
um, but you gave
Yeah.
a good answer. You kind of went along, and yeah, that was really revealing. And in
Yeah, for me it wasn't, for me in a way it wasn't, like I was lucky because I'm able to navigate these worlds in this country fairly smoothly because I grew up here and because I don't identify so strongly with a particular Asian community. I mean, I do now somewhat, and I have as an adult, but because of my family circumstances, you know, my parents immigrated in around 1950, which is very early for Koreans in the United States. You know, besides Hawaii, there are very few Koreans in the United States before the 70s. So that's why my situation is quite different than a lot of other Korean American artists who generally, most of them came, their families came in the 70s or later.
Yeah, I see. Thank you so much for sharing. And since we were talking about the way of kind of institution and how like minority artists get recognized, sometimes it has to I don't know if I should put it in this way, but kind of pleases a certain like a Western audience in order to um, be recognized. Do you think there's a difference from an institutional standpoint between tokenism and true diversity?
Oh, um, yes, definitely. There is the situation that I just described in the art field is nowhere near true equality. So there's plenty of tokenism going around still. The art world pats itself on the back, thinking it has made so much progress and gotten rid of a lot of that, but it still exists in many forms.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And I guess going back to your earlier career, what were some of the artists that influenced your earlier body of works?
Oh, well, there were quite a, it depends. Yeah, it depends how far back one goes, but I'll just start naming a lot of them then. Um, a painter named Bob Thompson, um, and um, Jacob Lawrence were very influential when I was, during the summer that I was in this program at in Skowhegan, Maine. And then later after that, they were both African American artists. Later after that, I became really interested in the work of Ad Reinhardt and Robert Smithson. Um, um, and then other artists such as Agnes Martin, Bryce Martin, um, let's see, Mark Rothko, obviously. Then Robert Irwin and oh, when I first came to New York, Tishan Su, who was primarily making paintings at the time, but he came to make more sculptural and digital works. His work was really interesting to me. So maybe that's the first Asian American artist who was really influential. And I'm trying to think of others early on when I first started. I guess the conceptual artists too, and that whole circle of artists like Saul LeWitt, Ava Hess, Robert Morris, Linda Benglis. I guess it goes on and on. Eleanor Anton, that whole group of original conceptualists, Vito Acconci. They didn't influence my work directly, but that movement was really important for me.
Yeah, and I also read about your story with the Rothko Chapel and your relationship with Mark Rothko and paying homage to him, taking the flight all the way to Texas just to see his chapel.
Yeah, to Houston. Yeah, just New York to Houston and back.
So I also wondering if there's any kind of spiritual element or connection in your work, and whether your earlier upbringing had any kind of spiritual or religion existence in your upbringing.
I didn't have any sustained formal spiritual or religious community or training when I was young. I became drawn to Buddhism and Taoism pretty recently, like in the last 15 years. And so, I mean, I would, more specifically, I would just say meditation. So I've become a very avid meditator. And so I think it connects somewhat to my working life, my art life, in the sense that I've come to realize that two things: nothing stays the same, everything changes, and also something about unity, like the relationship between the very small and the vast is exists, and everything is interconnected. It's not, like our little concerns and the the world around a tiny animal like an ant or a flower is related to the stars everything, the vastness. So I think that my work has always been related to that, but without knowing it in a way. And now it's a little bit more conscious.
Yeah, it's definitely so beautiful. You're connecting like Taoism with your work as this relationship with man, body, and nature. And I definitely want to touch up upon your signature work, Synecdoche. Although I know you probably get asked this all the time. How is this project going? Like, it's an ongoing work, as I understood. Um, can you?
Yeah, yeah. And I, it's ongoing, but it's not very consistent. So it's just, I think of it as one large, well, it's one project, but in some ways, I think of it as a very large painting as well, made of lots of little paintings. And it's simply lots of little examples of my observation of various humans' skin coloring. And so I never thought of it this way, but just because you mentioned Taoism just before asking that question, I think the color, the various colors on our body are one thing that remind us how we belong to nature. You know, we try to change that by changing our color, by wearing makeup or whatever, or wearing clothing. But you know, after all, we are natural beings as well. We are animals, and we, as much as we try to separate ourselves from nature, which has been very strongly in the last centuries, we are very much a part of nature and will go back to nature inevitably, whether we do it willingly or unwillingly.
Yeah,
Each of us and all of us will.
yeah,
Yeah.
from nature and returning to nature as well.
Mhm, mhm.
And that I really adore this kind of monochromatic like characteristics of our skin that you represented in this work. And I also really resonates with like what we do as our history, that we are kind of trying to paint portraits of each person, like now we're doing with you, and trying to weave through all these little details. And I felt like
Oh,
you're also
right. Yeah. Yeah. Your process is much more detailed than that. My process in that particular work, because it's one aspect of it is that didn't I needed it to be very practical. So everybody has obviously many colors on their body, but I chose just one color. Whether it was like one color that I'm focusing on, or like an average of color that I'm seeing on a person's arm, let's say. That was the way that I had to decide to do it. Otherwise, it would become a completely different work. And this project has so much more nuance to it. But it's similar actually, because I just would sit with somebody for half an hour, and there was often like, it wasn't, of course it was not a formal interview, but there were questions going back and forth usually, and but the only recording was this color. And whatever we can remember from those meetings, which is at this point from my end, not so much, although in the first couple hundred meetings, it was really surprising how much I could remember. But now there are 500, and not so much that there's so many of them, but like so much time has passed that it's hard for me to remember all the encounters.
That's interesting. And what are some of your most memorable sitters, if you wouldn't mind sharing a few?
Oh, um, for some reason, I remember a mom who came with her son to the Whitney Museum when I decided to do that recently. I made some maybe 70 or so more Synecdoche panels there. And she was just really happy. I think she was particularly happy to see an Asian American artist working in the museum. I don't know that she knew my work, but she herself was uh, I can't remember. I don't think she was Korean. I think she was Chinese, ethnically Chinese, and her son was half Chinese and half Western. And yeah, I remember that really clearly. Um, but you know, there are a lot of artists that I did partly because of the Whitney. The Whitney commissioned me. A curator at the Whitney commissioned me to do 40 of them. And quite a number of those individual subjects came by assignment, like by commission. So I really like it when I don't have to decide myself who to choose to paint. So even when I am deciding, I just do it very practically, like who I go somewhere to the park or to the Whitney Museum, and just whoever comes to me, that's who I'm doing. I never go and try to find any particular kind of person. Um, so yeah, there's my encounter with Via Selmans, who is I could very well have mentioned, and I should have mentioned when you asked me about artistic influences. She's a great artist, mostly painter, and my encounter with her skin color was really memorable, and I wrote an essay about it in the one small monograph that's been written about my work. Um, and oh, there's so many. It's really hard to. I mean, I said that out of the 500 or so, there are very few. I mean, it's hard to remember everybody for sure, but there's so many that I remember. There was two security guards at the National Gallery of Art that I remember in particular. Um, one was that because he was just so outgoing, and the other one who was opposite, not very outgoing, but she carried a gun, and she had been she was very familiar with the work because the National Gallery owns a big part of it. And she said that her skin color was not represented in the work yet. And so she was really happy that it was finally going to be represented, which was a very interesting point of view. Because it's true, even if I made 500 or 400 at that time, not every skin color would be represented already, which is just an astonishing fact, I think, because of the very limited biological factors or vectors that create our color, the color on the surface of our bodies. It's very few factors, including 3 kinds of pigment, but of course other things like the color of our blood and so forth. but it's just amazing how many different colors result.
Yeah, I did see a video of you trying to like some of them you have to use like more than 30 something colors to try to come up with the one
Yeah,
presentation.
I think theoretically I should be able to do it with just three, 3 or 4 or 5, but sometimes when I'm tired, especially, it takes a lot, because I'm not thinking very logically.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that process. And I'm also wondering with the you also painted bruise, like the kind of things that were related to pain and wounds on the body. What are those kind of different in terms of how you painted the skin color?
Oh, they were, in terms of the how, they were very different because for the most part, those paintings about bruises were the fabric was the coloration. The color was made by dyeing the fabric. So the color was actually in the fibers of the fabric. Whereas with Synecdoche, it's on a wood panel and it's oil paint on the surface of the panel. So it's a color that's on the surface as opposed to be. So with those bruise paintings, I wanted the process of making the painting to be a little bit similar to the subject matter, meaning I wanted the color to be inside the material itself. So it involved, taking the fabric off of the painting and dyeing it, and it was all either natural dye or pigment, mostly natural dyes, such as madder root or indigo or sandalwood or lots of things, logwood, different kinds of wood or roots or even flowers. A lot of one interesting uh, one interesting side note to that process was that a number of my dye materials came from the Chinese uh, pharmacy. So Chinese herbal doctors pharmacy. I got them in Seoul, Korea. Although I'm sure if I went to any major city in China, I could find the same area with all the Chinese medicine. So, for instance, gardenia flower makes a beautiful yellow, and sandalwood makes a really amazing red. And I don't know what medicinal properties two um, those two materials have, but I got the dye material from the pharmacy. In other words, they were not. I suppose in traditional Chinese medicine, the color is also a factor, but I don't think it's the main thing. Um, so in other words, it was just sort of coincidence that I could get these materials in abundance at the pharmacy as opposed to the art store, let's say.
Yeah, and thank you for sharing that process. And I'm also wondering with the kind of intention from this the skin color to the bruise. I'm not sure if there's one thing connected to another. Was it?
Yeah, well, they were, sorry to interrupt you, but they were about 20 years or more apart, beginning those skin color paintings and then the bruise paintings. And so they're related just in the way that is implied by the formulation of your question, because they're both having to do with human skin, right? Or the human body. But I think the easy, quick answer to your question has to do with the fact that I saw the bruise as something both, I was going to say ugly, I guess I can say ugly and beautiful at the same time. Um, and I'll explain myself by, well, the first time I ran across that notion of the bruise being not just a sign of violence or kind of difficult ugliness, um, was in a poem by Carl Phillips. He's a contemporary American poet who's about my age. Um, he, in a poem of his called Alba Innocence, Alba colon Innocence, there's a description of he's waking up and the morning sun is coming through the window, and he's beside him is his partner and or his lover, whoever he happens to be with, and he notices a bruise on this person's body, and he's then trying to imagine the different colors of the bruise, the different colors that the bruise will go through as it heals. So he imagines these colors and he can't quite imagine them. You know how you can't visualize a color often without seeing it, literally seeing it. So then he closes his good eye and looks out the window with his weak eye at the autumn leaves falling, and that's how he's able to imagine the colors better. So that was just a very long explanation, a very long description of a very short moment in that poem. And it made me realize how beautiful that process and how beautiful the colors are. And then when I went to go find examples of bruises, because I was determined not to, as opposed to synecdoche, I wanted to make these paintings of bruises be like bruises and not be related to bruises in the process of their making, in the process of making the painting, and not so much a representation of a particular bruise. It's not like I'm looking at someone's bruise and trying to copy it. Nevertheless, I wanted to see some examples of bruises so I could just have them in my consciousness. And the best place, like I was a little worried about going online to find pictures of bruises because the internet can be a source of very ugly images that you don't want to find even. But I actually, the best source for bruises for my purposes, all in one place, ended up being in a place that was not an unhappy place, which is that roller derby players. I don't know if you know what roller derby is, but it's a sport. I don't know if it's played by men and women. I guess so, but women are more famous for playing roller derby, and it's on. They play on roller skates and they go around in a rink, and they're two teams, and it's a little bit like pro wrestling. Like it's more theater than sport, and they part of it is that they hurt each other, but it's not. Actually, now I'm realizing maybe it's a little bit related to like BDSM, like bondage and that culture. Anyway, if you go online, you can find these athletes. They're very proud of their bruises. So they have lots of images of their bruises. So a lot of time their bruises come from falling down. So there's like huge bruises on their hips and backsides. So, and they're really happy and proud of them. So they just post them on the internet. And so that's where I found some of the ideas of the imagery. And of course, you know, I'm talking about this subject matter in a very kind of neutral or not so challenging, difficult way, but while acknowledging that the main connotation of the bruise is of violence and a kind of ugliness. And I knew that when if I put these paintings out in the world, that they would be seen mostly from that point of view. And so yeah, so that was a good, it's I never go, although I am like sometimes purposely take a naive point of view. um I wasn't naive to the notion that these paintings would be looked at in a particular way. And so when I had the first show of them, it was happened to be right at Trump's inauguration, and also not that long. I'm trying to get the timing right. I think I was making them during the previous period, during the so-called Arab Spring. So people were like very much assumed that I was making some kind of commentary about what was happening in the world. Also, Black Lives Matter protests and issues were starting to come up very strongly. So those things are definitely related to what I was thinking about with that work, but they weren't the initial impetus for making the work.
But you welcome the different interpretations of your work in relates to social justice.
Yeah, for sure I do. And I think probably, I have never said this before, but honestly, like, I welcome it very strongly because maybe I'm afraid to go there very directly myself in the beginning. So in other words, I have kind of like the excuse of that poem of I don't want to call it an excuse because I was reading that poem and it was a beautiful moment of visualizing through words that moment in the poem and in my life. And so it's like I'm only real I'm only thinking about this for the first time now, but maybe sometimes or maybe often I will my mind will come figure out a version of a subject matter that's not so challenging, like acceptable to me, so that it's not so painful. So I can face it, and I can use that subject matter as a subject for painting without it being so fraught. And then I can continue with that work, and then other people can interpret it in different ways.
Yeah, that's really empowering. And also, I remember you some of the works in your Sunday series. You had you definitely advocated and had voices with kind of a more political comments, and
Mm,
like those are kind of voluntary interpretation for like the more politically and more socially engaged side of your works, right?
yeah, maybe that's the one place where it can become more direct. Um, I mean, most of the time I'm talking about things in those paintings that are not very controversial or political or having to do with social justice, but occasionally I do. And so maybe that becomes much clearer when I do that. Um, a curator just asked me if I would hold on to the last year of those paintings because she was interested in proposing them for some kind of curatorial project, I guess. She just said project, but I didn't, this is somebody who I really trust, so I didn't question it. And so I'm wondering whether it's for that reason. Like so much has happened in this past year, but a lot of time, like when when I realized that that might be the reason for showing all these, 50 paintings or whatever, all in the same moment, I was thinking, well, all this stuff is going on in the world, but I don't talk about it every week, you know. Often it's just I went swimming, you know, I had lunch because, and that's like, to me, I don't know that much about Taoism, but like that's one of my takeaways from the little bit of reading Zhuangzi, just like there's these big, vast, important things, and then there's just our little, very unimportant lives, and it's or even less than that, non-life too. It's all connected somehow. Yeah.
Yeah, and definitely your work, as I heard a lot from, that would evoke a sense of sublime and how the nature can wow the human beings, as how yeah, like grand and overwhelming they can be. Have those been part of your sources of inspiration?
Um,
I also remember you mentioning being out in the sea and swimming. Those are
right.
many times you encounter nature, and what are
Yeah.
other forces?
I'm sorry, I got distracted and I didn't hear the question. Were you asking about how, sorry, can you ask the question again?
Sure, sure. Sorry, it was a little long. I did that too. So yeah, I was just interested in the way how you kind of transition from body to nature, and how the nature can be part of your work, and where's that transition came from, and how this sense of sublime became a source of your work.
Oh, yeah. Oh, I almost feel like that question, maybe that's why I blanked because it was too big a question. Um, I almost feel like that question could be the whole interview. Like I could try to answer that question for 90 minutes and I would be unable to, but um, I think that the sublime in terms of our relationship to nature was very much in my mind when I started to become an artist because the most important the most important influence aesthetically in my early life was from the so-called romantic poets, um, Wordsworth, especially Wordsworth, but Keats, Coleridge, Blake, English romantic poets. That's what I studied a lot in college. and then also the American transcendentalists, like Emerson and Whitman, and I don't think Emily Dickinson is included, but I would like to include her as well. Um, they were very influential. Um, but I think that because I was so involved with that as literature, I wasn't really somehow joining that with nature, with its relationship to nature. Obviously, it has so much to do with nature, but like nature in my life was not so integrated yet. And so it's only in my old age now that I feel how important nature is. And so I don't think about the sublime so much anymore. And partly maybe because it's too obvious, but like, and this goes back to the answer to the previous question. So um, sometimes I am seizing on a subject matter that doesn't seem so like it's the more palatable version of a difficult and challenging subject matter, just so I can approach it without fear or pain. And so, like, my current subject matter, which is there are a few examples in the show at the Moody. It just appears to be like kind of imagined lands, ocean. You mentioned that I've been doing a lot of swimming, so like, and I'm working on some now, actually, in this room. Um, and to me, the bigger subject matter has to do with the way that we impact our earth, or we in the media we know it as climate change, but I don't really talk about this work as like my climate change work, and I don't talk about those bruise paintings as like social justice work, paintings or something like that. But it's the first time in a way that I've talked about this, because I never articulated it to myself this way. But I need to have a way of making work about a painful subject that's not so painful. So I think the sublime, actually, as a great subject, involves pain is a little bit too specific, but like it definitely involves some negative emotions like fear. It's not just, oh, beauty, just beauty. There's like, if there isn't beauty mixed with fear, or that's those things mixed together make something like awe. Everybody uses the word awesome all the time, and so that word doesn't mean anything anymore. But when it used to mean something, it was what maybe I'm most interested in my work, that kind of subject matter.
Next, I'm curious what you would think art should be universally understood, or it should be more applicable to the artist personally.
Oh, I'm not sure what you mean. Um,
Yeah, sorry, I should clarify further. Like, should artists make art for um,
oh, I
yeah,
see.
yeah.
Yeah. Um, I think either way is fine. If the artist makes art for everyone, it's fine. And if the artist makes art just for themselves, it's fine. Or just for one person, or even for nobody. There should be that much freedom, I think.
Yeah, I totally understand. Um, and next, I'm sure you came across this kind of representation question a lot. That when people mention you, you're probably a lot of times kind of labeled as Korean American or Asian American artists. I'm wondering what you think, whether it's okay to categorize artists by race, and if so, to what extent?
That's a tough question. I would like to answer that it's not okay, but that's not a realistic answer in my mind. I think that we live in a world where it's still very, these categories are very much still in play. And it would be very interesting to live in a world with um, none of these categories. Um, yeah, it makes me very emotional just to even think about it. But I I don't think it makes it's possible anytime soon. Um, that's not to say that we shouldn't strive towards that. So I don't know how to answer that question. I want to answer the question that it's not okay, but on the other hand, that's just how the world is now. So in some ways, it's helpful and comforting to some people to have these categories, and I completely understand that. It's it's comforting. It brings comfort to the people who would use these categories in a negative way and in a positive way. So I guess I would just say that it's something that we have to live with for now.
Yeah, definitely. And I feel like with the uprising conversations on this topic, it definitely deserves time for us to dwell on this. And the next part, it's a two-part question. Um, so, what is the most misunderstood aspect of Asian American artists by non-Asian American audiences? And the second part is, what is the most misunderstood by the Asian audiences about Asian American artists? Um,
Oh,
I'm curious to see your answer.
wow, that's really hard. Um, hmm.
Yeah, we talked about the representation, like people, like artists, kind of had the burden to be representation and expected to appear in certain ways. Um, like, what were some of the things that you wish that weren't part of that burden when people read your work?
Um, I don't know. I guess occasionally I have made work that is related to my cultural heritage. Um, and so when I'm making that kind of statement, then I understand that it makes sense to take that into consideration. On the other hand, most of my work, it doesn't really come into play that much or at all. So then I wonder whether it makes sense to take that into consideration at all. And so I don't know. I just assume that people don't take it into consideration that much when they're looking at my work. But that might not be true. Maybe that's all they think of is the fact that I'm a Korean American artist. Um, so, mm, as far as um, was the first part of the question having to do with like the audience, the American audience for Asian American artists? Yeah, so I don't think unless the artist is making a point of being an Asian American artist in their work, I don't think that it should matter that much or at all. It shouldn't come into their understanding of the work. Um, the And I guess maybe this seems like an easy way out of the question, but I guess I have the same answer about people from outside of this country also, how they think of Asian American artists. It's easy for me to answer that way because I don't think most of my work has to do with that subject matter. It might be a very different answer for an Asian American artist whose work is a lot about being Asian American, you know. Then I don't know how they would want to answer that question, but I'm just answering it for myself. So
Yeah,
that's my answer.
yeah, totally understandable. And thank you for sharing. And I'm also curious, what do you think about the representation of the Asian artists in America? Does it need any change in your opinion?
Mm, I think yes, definitely, just in the sense that Asian artists, artists of Asian descent in whatever creative field should be represented more equitably. I think that we are very underrepresented, and depending on which field, it's can be quite severe. Like, you know, you see you see slightly more Asians in the entertainment field, for instance, but it's crazy how little what the percentage in relation to. I mean, I don't even know any statistics, but just by my viewing media, like the amount of Asian Asians in the entertainment field um, relative to, I'm sure, the number of people who are trying to gain access to that field is extremely low. And I'm sure the same thing goes for my field. There are not that many Asian. There aren't that many Asian American artists that are that are that have access to uh, the kind of the machinery of of the art world. Interestingly, though, there seem to be like the number of Asian American workers in a certain aspect of the field seems fairly well represented, such as museum curators. But I don't know. I haven't seen statistics about that, so I might be wrong. But it seems better there than in among artists.
thank you for sharing. Next, I'm curious, what are some of your advice to the younger generation of artists, or specifically the AAPI artists?
I guess to not to take no for an answer, and also to just keep working and to I think it's a good idea to keep together, you know, like I mean, it sounds maybe contradictory or paradoxical, but like I think it's good to um, stay in touch with people with whom you find common ground. And it's important to just stay in touch and keep in touch with, you know, a group of friends that you feel close to. And that's how things are gonna happen. And the rest will, I hope the rest will take care of itself. You know, you have to spend a lot of time with your work, a lot of time and care with your work. And that just goes without saying. It doesn't matter whether you're Asian or who you are or what field you're in. So that advice, I don't even have to give. Yeah. Just keep trying.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. Next, I'm thinking moving on to more of your personal life side. What do you do outside of work, and how do you manage work-life balance?
Oh, so much of it has been devoted to family in the last, especially, well, my whole life. But you know, I guess our oldest kid, my wife, Lisa Siegel, is also an artist, a very good artist, and she and I have 3 kids, and the oldest, Emmett, is 20. He was born in 93, so he's gonna turn how old is he? He's gonna turn 28 very soon. And so that, you know, the last 30 years has been, a lot of it has been about this relationship of this family. And so so much of it kind of derives from that, my personal life. But of course, there's also my art life, which has to do with making paintings mostly and teaching. So I really enjoy teaching. Um, and I've been lucky to be able to teach students who are very ambitious students. And so, yeah, between those things and living between New York and California, and, you know, caring for my parents, along with my sister caring for my parents. It takes a lot of, it takes care of a lot of that, a lot of my life. And yeah, when I just said caring for my parents, it sounded a little funny to me because they've cared for me for so long. So it's just kind of like giving back in a way. So that seems like a very Asian thing.
Yeah, I feel like it's a definitely virtual as well. And and I remember you mentioned in one of your other interviews that you met your wife at a very yeah, like relatively early on in your life, and you've been together for all of your life. And like I'm curious, what is the secret in sustaining um, such a long and happy marriage? And you guys do a lot of things as like part of swimming as part of your
Yeah, I think the key is to do things together, but also do things apart. Like it wouldn't work if everything was together. And so we have our own separate lives, even though it seems like everything is all worked out together, such as family and, we've been swimming together, but like this morning she went swimming and I rode my bike. And that's just a very minor, kind of simple and silly example, but like if you carry that through to your whole relationship, then it makes more sense and it works out better, at least for us.
yeah. Thank you so much for sharing. And next, I understand we're approaching the end of the interview as we want to be mindful of your time as well. Could you share with us what you'll be doing in the next 5 to 10 years if you have that in mind?
Oh, I just remember making a very silly promise to myself, and maybe I even voiced it to other people when I was quite young. And it was just off the cuff. Like I internalized it, but I remember coming up with it. I don't know. I don't, pretty early on. I don't know why I came up with it, but I told myself that I would be making my best work when I was 60. I'm not sure why I decided that. It seemed so far away. And then I'm turning 60 this year. So I just realized, oh, I used to say that all the time. And now that it means I have to like fulfill that promise to myself. So I don't know if I can actually, but at least I have to try. So what that means is in the next 5 to 10 years, I have to try a little harder, I think, because I think during the 20 plus years of raising 3 kids with my partner, Lisa, um, I was a little distracted from that part, um, my work. And somehow it survived. My practice still survived. And so I'm so grateful for that. And so that's what I think I need to do in the next 5 or 10 years. And then also just try to, I mean, I'm not so capable with this part, but try to help the different difficult and challenging situations that so many people are going through in our country and in the world right now. And the thing that I realized astonishingly recently is that like that can partly happen through my work. It doesn't always have to be through, you know, some kind of activism, but it also can be the other way. It doesn't have to be through my work.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of things going on, especially the very heartbreaking Atlanta shooting we all heard of about 3 4 weeks ago, and wondering how it impacted you personally.
Yeah, when something like that severe happens, I have trouble examining it too closely because it just makes me too upset. Um, Having said that, it makes me realize that Asian Americans are being targeted. In a strange way, that horrible incident in Atlanta, it both highlighted how much hardship and discrimination Asian Americans are going through now, but it in some ways obscured it too, because that was such a huge incident and it just takes so much attention. So I don't know. I'm not a really great spokesperson for these issues, but and just answering your question about how it's affected me, it just makes me it makes me sad. That's the direct answer to your question. It makes me want to do something. I don't know exactly what I can do, but I keep, I keep responding to people. I've had a couple of groups. One student group reached out to me and I interacted with them. And yeah, we all have to start in our small way, like, whatever that is. And in my in my case, it starts probably to my school community and then spreads out from
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And I guess last we invite all our interviewees to join us on a time capsule to kind of leave a message for the descendants of yours, like your grandchildren and grandchildren's children and so on. What would you like to say to them?
Oh, I would just like to tell them that we are all one, whether we're Asian descent or whether we are animal, vegetable, or mineral. Um, we're all part of one thing. And so just to proceed with that in mind, that's all.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's really kind and some full of wisdom. Thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks so much to you too.